I do think that there are different levels of analysis we can have for the situation we're in currently, the global war on terrorism. Already, it seems like it's a long history. I mean, this was a very long period of war and occupation since 2001, 2 decades. Um, but we could also look at it as a post World War II kind of phenomenon, continuation or reorientation of the Cold War, the era of U.S. Supremacy, as a superpower with its rivals, but attempting hegemony in the world. But I think in some ways, when we look at the reason why the global war on terrorism had such purchase, it wasn't just because America was attacked on 9/11 with the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon, and so on, but because there already was a pre-existing sense of the Muslim as an enemy and the Islamic world as a historic rival to something called Christendom. And even though that term is really out of fashion, except on the far right or in certain kind of extreme Christian nationalist circles in evangelical groups and so on in the U.S., it's out of fashion. But it was just secularized in some ways as Europe and Europe's you know global colonial and imperial drive in the early modern period. We think of it as the expansion of Europe. That also, of course, brought Europeans to this hemisphere in the Americas and the establishment of settler colonies. But before it was Europe, really, I think you have to understand what Christendom meant, because it equally was a very universalist imagination of transforming the whole world, that all the world should be under Christian power and authority. And the idea of Christendom territorially really is coextensive with the areas that were under that recognize the popes. They recognize the Pope as somehow the sort of titular spiritual, if not in some cases territorial leader of a group of states and societies that were bound together. And what made them that was that on some level it wasn't just about faith and their ideas about religious practice and so on. It was also who they identified collectively as the threat or the enemy to this project of universal dominion. And I think you can't really understand Christendom without thinking about crusade. These are essentially coincidental in history, that they emerge. The emergence of the crusading movement and the idea of Christendom happen at the same time. And I guess the reason why I think it's important to go back to this is because even when you look at the Cold War politics, it's absolutely crucial to understand the way in which U.S. foreign policy and its concerns in international affairs during the Cold War and rivalry with communism were so significant to the way in which it used the threat of communism to suppress dissent and to suppress movements for egalitarianism, for reform and change of the economy, but also for racial justice and equality. And it was really because of Cold War pressures, one could argue, and I think many American historians have started to argue and recognize, that the foreign policy questions were actually quite crucial to opening up, new legislation, desegregating in the 50s. And what made somebody really dangerous, to my mind, somebody like Malcolm X became extremely dangerous. Of course, he was a radical threat to the existing racial order as a black nationalist in the Nation of Islam. But when he started connecting in his analysis more overtly, embarrassing the United States or in the world opinion, and going and visiting new post-colonial nation states in Africa that had freed themselves from empire, where the US was competing with the communist bloc, with the Soviet Union for influence, for commercial ties, and so on, that's when he became a really dangerous figure because it really risked US interests and hegemony abroad. So I think the same kind of thing we can see is really important. This external pressure, the sense of crisis and emergency that justifies internal regulation and rule. And that's what we find with the suppression of heresy in medieval Europe during this period. The kind of configuring of Jews as an internal enemy that is related and associated with the Muslim as the external rival and enemy. And so I began to see in my own studies that there were these patterns that even if some of the aspects change, because we're talking about secular politics, communism, and so on, versus, Christianity versus Islam or Judaism, Muslims and Jews, that nonetheless there was a kind of pattern of persecution internally that was connected and related to threats and militarism abroad. So I like to think that some of the foundations of whiteness and of really thinking of what is whiteness come from the ethnicization of Catholic Christianity during this period and the way in which religion was the kind of dominant mode of understanding identity, so that it wasn't really race yet at this point, as much as it was suppressing heresy, which was forms of religious dissent, and persecuting an alien religious group, that is the Jews that were within the society, while having and mobilizing all of society over the course of 200 years of wars, of continuous war, because of the threat of Islam and Muslims and the fact that we needed, what am I saying? But I mean that the crusade, the crusading society, needed to expand and conquer, capture Jerusalem, but really as part of an expansion that basically Jerusalem was understood as the center of the world and a kind of theological as well as geographic understanding. And so that is from where could spread, the expansion of Christendom into a global universalist form of rule. So that's just sort of the outlines of why I thought that when we looked at Islamophobia and the use of the Muslim as the enemy, as the kind of paradigmatic enemy of a geopolitical identity of Christendom, that basically we had a similar pattern, and that this discourse and these patterns of thought were already available from such a long period of history, whether it was, during the Crusades or even in the early modern period, rivalry with the Ottoman Empire and thinking of the Turk as this great, rival and enemy, as an alternate system that had to be overcome in order for Christendom and then later Europe to become dominant. And so, maybe the Cold War was a departure in some ways. This is something that Samuel Huntington really actually argued in his Clash of Civilizations, is that the Cold War, capitalism versus communism, was a departure from what he saw as the much longer, perduring clash of civilizations, principally that rivalry between Christendom and Islam. But, he adds a coda at the end that I think is so prescient for the politics we're talking about today, that the other emerging real rival was, Chinese civilization, as another one that really there was no possibility for rapprochement between these rival civilizations, and that with the end of the Cold War we would see the resurgence again of cultural or civilizational kinds of conflict. So it seems like it was already ready and available. And if you look back at this older history, there has always been this kind of discourse of imagining the Muslim and the world of Islam as this great rival to crusade against.